Hello and welcome. I'm Sam Califer, your host for Vision, the show where we talk all about the College of Arts and Sciences as well as its faculty and students. Today, I'm joined by Dr. Lourdes Cardozo Gaibisso, an assistant professor in the Department of English. Thanks for being here.
Thank you so much for having me, Sam. I'm excited to be here with you today.
Yeah, I'm so excited to have you on and talk about your research. And so to start, I was hoping you could just introduce yourself and how did you get into your area of expertise?
Yeah, so my name is Lourdes Cardozo Gaibisso. As we talked before, I started my career as a middle school teacher in my home country in Uruguay. I did my bachelor's of English as a second language there. I taught for a few years, then pursued my master's degree in research in teaching and learning. And I got so fascinated with research that I decided to pursue my PhD. So I won a Fulbright scholarship to come to the US.
That's awesome.
Thank you.
Yeah.
And I went to the University of Georgia in 2014 for my PhD in language and literacy education.
Yeah.
And I was very lucky to get a research assistantship in the Department of Theory and Practice, working on an NSF-funded grant.
Yeah.
And that was my first introduction to the world of science literacy, cultural linguistically sustaining pedagogies. And sometimes I think back and it's been 10 years since I started.
Wow.
And it's been 10 wonderful years. After graduation, I went home for 2 years. I worked at the Universidad of Uruguay as an assistant professor. And I worked there on data literacy for children and preteens with colleagues from Australia and Uruguay. And in 2021, I got to Mississippi State, and I've been teaching here and researching ever since.
Yeah, and so you're in the English department and you're filling this very important role of linguistics. And so you do the teaching English to second language learners. That's kind of your field of expertise. And so it's so cool to hear that you were that teacher.
Yes.
And maybe y'all were teaching English then, but you have that first-hand experience. And so, yeah, so cool to have you here. And so many years later, you've written a book about all this stuff. So it's called Pedagogies for Equitable Access, Reimagining Multilingual Education for an Uncertain World.
I need to give you an award for that. Yes, that's a long title, right?
So tell me about the book and what are you trying to accomplish through it?
Yeah, so this is a co-edited volume. I had the opportunity to work with wonderful colleagues from Oregon State University, the University of Georgia, and the University of North Georgia. And so in 2020, we started thinking about the effects of the pandemic in teaching and learning for multilingual students. At that time, we conceptualized the book as best practices during the pandemic. But then we quickly realized that what we actually wanted to capture was the aftermath or the effects of the pandemic in our kids, in the children learning other languages. And so we came together with this book as a way to, showcase studies from around the world, from Colombia. We have studies from Colombia, Uruguay, the US, China, and so we want to showcase successful practices both in elementary and also high school and higher education. But we also want to make the book a call for action, because one thing that we realized is that after the pandemic, we had this expectation that things were going to be much better. And the pandemic sort of showed us all the inequities, and the question now that we need to ask ourselves is that what are we going to do with that information, right? We have so many competing priorities. We have the ideal and the real. We need to reconcile the resources we have and the needs of our multilingual children in the US and in the world. So the book is a call for action to start thinking, these collective efforts are great, and these scholars are doing fabulous work, but now we need to think about long-term sustainability of these projects after the pandemic.
Yeah, just focusing in on the pandemic, was maybe too small.
Exactly.
But yeah, it's like the pandemic brought about a lot of change, and so it's like, well, maybe we can change it for the better.
Yes.
And so, yeah, I'm so glad that you've done that work. And so, yeah, I mean, what are even the title, so what are those like pedagogies or strategies? How do you bring, that cultural knowledge or the linguistics into the class, and how does that improve the education? Yeah,
so I think that for many years the question was, if you should, and now the question is how, because we know for sure that when we work with multilingual youth, children, youth, and families, the answer is always you need to bring their cultures and their languages into the equation,
right?
Because they need to use their repertoires in order to learn,
right?
So, for example, in the particular field of science education where I work what we do is try to sort of think about how are we conceptualizing science? It's just this idea about a neutral discipline, or are we thinking about science as something that can be built and learned to be practiced? For the longest time, science was something you learned at school, you memorized concepts, but we never thought about the practices. So, that the equity comes when you're able to show children to do science and using their own linguistic and cultural repertoires in the process for them to see themselves as future scientists, which is what we want to achieve at the end with our work.
Right. And I think that's important to notice is in any classroom, there is culture that is being brought into it, but it's only for certain students. So I think some of your work is let's level the playing field. And if you think about the way education works, it's like metaphors even. Like someone from a different cultural background might not get the metaphor you're using. So I think you're trying to bring attention to some of that. So interesting. And why is that important? Because when I learned about your research, this stood out to me as a lot of times people say it's either you're good at reading or math and science, but your research is kind of showing, well, you need literacy to excel in those classes. So what has your research shown you in regards to all that, I guess?
That's a really good question, because we tend to think about literacy in terms of reading and writing.
Right.
But literacy is also discipline specific. So you can, it's not the same to read and write in history than in science or in math. You need special skills to do that. It's also been historically that, science was a discipline that was meant for, certain populations. Not everybody had access to it. And so, that idea of decolonizing those spaces so everybody can become a scientist and can see themselves. They can make a decision later, but everybody can see themselves as a scientist.
Yeah.
And so my research has shown me a couple of things. So mainly, when you bring students' cultures and languages into the classroom, you get better test scores, you get better assessment performance, classroom instruction becomes much more effective for teachers, families become more interested in working with teachers and coming to school, you get better retention, and you also get students engaged in post-secondary opportunities more often than you don't. So they're all really good points that we need to effectively continue pursuing.
Yeah, and if you start thinking about it, it really makes a lot of common sense. If you show your class that you're interested in them, you're willing to learn about them and their culture, and there's that connection there, I think there's more, they're more invested too. They're not just having to sit there and learn. So and I think, so good, but it's good to have the research done and have those figures to kind of prove it. And so, very cool research that you're doing. And when we were figuring out this interview, you mentioned that you have a science lab or a lab that you do research in, which is something I don't think people think about for an English professor. So what kind of work do you do in that lab you have?
Yeah, so I'll tell you a little bit about the story because I need to give credit to a few people here. So when I first came to State in 2021, I had my college mentor, Dr. Holly Sides from Communications. She told me everything about the Social Science Research Center, and she has her lab there. And she was the first person that opened my eyes to the possibility of me having a lab as well. A few months later, I met Dr. Devon Brenner, director of the Social Science Research Center, the SSRC, and she welcomed me and she helped me with this idea of creating my lab. And so in 2022, I funded, but I think it's a collective work, so I always say we. The SLI, the Science Literacy for Equity Research Collaboratory.
Awesome.
And I've been working there now it's going to be 2 years now in November. And I think one of the good things or the coolest thing about the lab is, that I not only get to do my own research, but I also get to mentor our students. So currently I have 2 research projects there. SMILE, which is Scientific and Inquiry, Learning and Engineering, which is a project that was funded by the Strategic Research Initiative for the College of Arts and Sciences, which we're very thankful for. And I'm working with Dr. Sharice Narsipur from Aerospace. And we did a pilot study across Mississippi, and now we're hoping that next year we're going to start working with 1 school district and 3 schools on bringing those ideas and that pedagogical model into the classroom. And then Sistemas, Simulative Immersive Science through Engaging a Multilingual Scenario, which is an NIH SIPA award with colleagues from the University of Georgia that we're going to have for 5 years. And we're currently working on a video game called Virtual Vet. So
a video game.
we are excited to bring the bilingual video game to children so they can be more engaged with science content.
Yeah.
Very exciting.
That is so cool. So what does like a linguistic lab look like? I mean, do y'all have like, computers that you use, or like, I guess like from the day to day, what does the work look like? So
it's a collaboratory because the idea is that we have a space where we work on both quantitative and qualitative things. It's not a science lab that people would imagine. I'm in the Department of English and I'm a linguist.
Right.
So we don't have anything machine-like or things that people would imagine. So the idea of the lab is to be an open space for the researchers, but also to mentor.
Sure.
And I love the fact that the Science Literacy for Equity Research Collaboratory is becoming that, the research of the professor, but also the ability to mentor our undergrad students.
Yeah.
And so it's a space where I work, my students work, they have their own time there, their own desks where they work, and they also have the opportunity to work with other researchers from the center.
Oh, wow.
So for the past 2.5 years, I've worked with 4 students, 1 grad and 3 undergrads, and they're off to Peace Corps, med school. It's been wonderful. They're doing great things. So that's been wonderful.
That's awesome. Yeah, and you were talking about Smile, one of your projects, and that's something that has stood out on your research, is that there's always this very real world application to it. So you're, in that you're looking at English language learners in STEM classes, but I know some of the work is like, in order for everyone to have a chance to have these great jobs and careers, we need to make this kind of education more equitable and make sure there's space for everyone there. So I just think that's so cool. It's not all theoretical. It has these real world applications, and then you're also working with our own students. So cool, and I'm so glad you can make it here to Mississippi State with all your expertise.
Thank you.
Yes.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you for coming on the show today.
Yeah.
And thank you all for tuning in to this episode of Vision. We'll see you next time.